In this video, I'm going to talk about the keyboard control system. I'll cover why you should use it, how to use it, and then we'll see how to switch between different keyboard control configurations using scenes before we dig a little deeper into the scene system. I've started to put together a performance with various parts to illustrate all these things, and I just want to talk briefly about the order in which I've assembled the various performance parts. I started out with the dark vintage pad ANX performance because I want to be able to use the super knob behaviors attached to that sound. I've also brought in the mellow Hamburg grand piano, the golden EP Rhodes electric piano, a synth bass part called Synth Stuff, a string ensemble called Warm Big, and a drum kit with some rhythm arpeggios assigned called Techno Theme. You'll notice that the drums are continuing to play even after I've released the keys, and the reason for that is that that part has ARP hold on. To stop them, just turn off the master ARP switch and turn it back on again so it's ready next time we play. While all these other performances have super knob control when you run them individually, those super knob assignments aren't retained when you import the parts into another performance like this one, and as I haven't fully covered control assign in this video series yet, we'll just have to live with that. Before we get into keyboard control, I just need to set up a split on the keyboard, because right now the bass part covers the entire range of the keyboard. So let's open the split interface so that we can see that right now we have one split at point C3. I'm going to change that split to C#2 so that Zone A will run from the lowest extent of the keyboard up to C2, and Zone B will cover all the keys higher than that. I'll assign the bass part to Zone A, and I'll assign the strings to Zone B. I'm also going to assign the drums to Zone A so that they're only triggered by the lower part of the keyboard. If we come out of solo mode and play the keyboard, you'll see that all parts play, and you might be able to hear something that sounds a bit off right now with the piano and Rhodes sounds. The reason they sound weird is that the dark vintage pad performance has portamento enabled, although I struggle to hear the effect on that sound specifically, but the portamento setting affects all parts by default. Pianos aren't really meant to have portamento, so we have two choices here. We could either turn off the global portamento switch to the left of the panel, which will turn off portamento for all the parts, or we could go and edit the individual parts and change the portamento setting, which is what I'm going to do. We'll go to General Pitch and then turn off portamento for the piano and for the Rhodes. And now the pianos sound like pianos again. So what is keyboard control and why would you want to use it? When you have a multi-part performance like this, you're going to want to be able to change which parts actually respond when you play the keyboard. You might want to just play the Rhodes, or maybe you want to play the piano and the pad, and then at some point in the song you'll want to bring in the bass and the drums. And you might be thinking that there's an easy solution to that. Just mute the parts that you don't want at any particular time. But using mute and solo works quite differently from keyboard control, and their use brings with it something that I think is undesirable. Let's solo the pad, which effectively mutes all the other parts. I'll play a chord and sustain it with a pedal. Now I want to play the Rhodes on top of the chord I'm sustaining, so I'll move the solo over to the Rhodes. And before I've played a single note, my pad is abruptly cut off. That's because mute and solo work at the mixer level by preventing the sound from the tone generator reaching any of the outputs. So what we just tried to do is actually impossible if we use mute and solo. Keyboard control works differently by configuring which performant parts are actually played by the keyboard rather than controlling the output of the tone generator. Each part of a performance has this keyboard icon, which can be toggled on or off by clicking it on the screen. You can also control it by switching the part buttons to keyboard control mode so that they glow green. To see how this works, let's turn off keyboard control for every part. To play a part that has keyboard control disabled, you have to select it directly. So let's switch the part buttons back to part select mode and play a few notes from each of those parts. If we select common so that the performance itself and no individual parts are selected, all parts with keyboard control enabled will play, which right now is none of them, so nothing at all will play. Let's add keyboard control to the pad, the piano and the bass, and now when we have common selected, all of them will play. You don't have to have common selected. In fact, if you select any of the parts that have keyboard control enabled, then the entire group will play. But as soon as you select a part that does not have keyboard control, then just that part will play, and the parts in the keyboard control group will not. So let's see what happens when we switch parts using keyboard control. As before, I'm going to play and sustain a chord with the pad. And of course we'll also hear the piano and the bass because all those parts have keyboard control. Now I'll select the Rhodes and I can play over the sustained chord. Of course that's a rather obtuse demo, but where this system really shines is when you're playing sounds that have a long release, because switching to a different part will not cut off the release phase of the notes that you played from the previous part. There is a limitation to the keyboard control system, which rears its head when you add sounds to parts 9 to 16, as I've done with this guitar and this flute. You'll note that these parts don't have the keyboard control icon, and that's because you cannot add parts 9 to 16 to the keyboard control group. That means that in order to play these parts with the built-in keyboard, you must select them directly. That also means you can't play parts 9 to 16 from the built-in keyboard at the same time as any of the first 8 parts. Parts 9 to 16 can be played at the same time as parts 1 to 8 via MIDI from an external keyboard or sequencer, and if you really want to get them to play from the built-in keyboard, you can get around this limitation to some extent with some MIDI routing in a DAW, or by running a MIDI cable from the MIDI out straight back to the MIDI in port, but that's a subject for another time. If all you want to do is to be able to play a particular group of parts together and play the remaining parts individually, you can set up your keyboard control group for the ensemble parts and then select the other individual parts when you want to play those. But more likely, you're going to want to play different groups of parts at different points in the song you're playing, and that's going to involve changing which parts have keyboard control. Now you could manually change the parts that have keyboard control while you're playing, but I think that's asking for trouble, as you could easily hit the wrong button and end up playing completely the wrong sound. That's where scenes come in. A montage performance can define up to 8 scenes, which will allow you to switch between different variations of the performance. I'm going to show you 2 different approaches for working with scenes, one of which is more powerful but easier to mess up, and another that's largely foolproof but limits flexibility somewhat. So I'm going to store a copy of my performance now before we configure any scenes. Scenes are configured in the scene interface, which you can access via the performance home screen. This performance that I've based on Dark Vintage Pad already has some scenes programmed, so before I continue, I'm just going to remove all of the parameters that are being controlled by those scenes so that we have effectively no programming. And you'll see that as I switch between scenes, none of them stay illuminated as I leave them, so that means there's no programming attached. So there are lots of parameters that can be controlled by scenes, including the arpeggio master switch and the selected arpeggio number, the same but for motion sequences, the position of the super knob, and which which assignable knobs are linked to it, various controls relating to the mixer, including levels and panning of the individual parts, along with their FX send levels and certain filter settings. The selection of parts that have keyboard control, the master ADSR envelope for the amplifier, and a variety of parameters for arpeggios and motion sequences. My preferred approach is to only program those particular systems that I actually want to use, and we're going to start off by using keyboard control. I want to switch my performance to play a different selection of instruments at different parts of the song, and switching keyboard control with scenes is the key to getting that working. My song is going to start with a solo piano, and then switch to the Rhodes with a pad. I could set scene 1 to have keyboard control on the piano alone, and then set scene 2 to switch to the Rhodes and pad, but that would actually be a waste of one of the 8 scenes, because if the piano is not part of the keyboard control group, I can play it on its own by simply selecting the part. So I'm just going to configure scene 1 so it manages keyboard control alone and give the Rhodes and the pad keyboard control. I can do this either directly on the interface in the scene, in which case my settings are automatically saved, or I can do it using the various physical controls on the panel, after which I need to store the settings to the scene. To do that, hold down either of the shift buttons and then press on the scene button you want to configure. Right now this scene only manages keyboard control, so it will only store the keyboard control settings, but if the scene was set to manage any other settings, it would store those at the same time too. So let's manage the next couple of sections of my imaginary song, where I'll introduce the drums and then the bass. In the scene management interface, I'm going to select scene 2 and tell it to manage keyboard control. Then I'll enable keyboard control on drums on part 6. For scene 3, I'll do the same, but I'll add the bass to my keyboard control group. Let's test what we've got so far. I'll switch to scene 1 and use the part buttons to select my piano. When I want to play the Rhodes and the pad, I'll select common so that the parts with keyboard control play. Now I'll switch to scene 2, and when I hit a key, the drums will start. And finally we have scene 3, which introduces the bass. So far, we've only been switching the parts with keyboard control using scenes, but scenes can do so much more. The drum part on this performance has 5 different rhythm arpeggios attached to it, which we can switch using the ARP select global arpeggio number to switch between 1 and 8. On the classic montage, it was possible to directly select the arpeggio number with a single click on the button grid, and I do miss that ability. But anyway. I'd like my song to progress with a slightly busier drum pattern, and I think that number 3 fits the bill. So I'm going to use the scene we just configured to also change the arpeggio number. In the scene management interface, I'm going to select scene 3 and enable ARP control for scene 3. I'll select arpeggio number 3 and store that to the scene. And this is where the complexity of this approach begins, because you might expect that if we now switch back to scene 1 or 2, the arpeggio would revert to the first pattern, but it won't, because those scenes don't have arpeggio control at all. If we left the performance like this, it would load up using arpeggio number 1 and continue to use that until we select scene 3, at which point it would switch to use arpeggio number 3, and we'd have no way of switching back to arpeggio number 1 using the scene buttons. Sometimes that might be exactly what you want, but if it's not, we need to go back to the scenes that we already configured and tell them to also configure arpeggios and select number 1. You might be thinking that setting scene 1 to control the arpeggio is unnecessary because the drums aren't triggered by scene 1, but this is where you have to think ahead, because if we're switching back to scene 1, then the drums that had already been triggered by scene 3 would continue to play because of ARP hold, and because we aren't actually muting the drum part. So if we switch directly from scene 3 to scene 1, we'd be hearing the third arpeggio instead of the first. So we need to configure scene 1 to also select the first arpeggio. With that done, we can now switch between the scenes and hear them working. Let's keep going and set up scene 4 to change the arpeggio again, but also to make use of the super knob behavior that I talked about at the beginning of the video. I'll start out by selecting scene 3 as a starting point, and then activate scene 4 with the keyboard control, ARP control, and super knob control. Let's change the ARP to select the version. Let's change the ARP to select number 4, and then in the super knob settings, we'll dial it all the way to the top, and then store that to scene 4. If you've been paying attention, you will have already spotted the problem here, that being that as with the arpeggio switch change, we now have a scene that changes the super knob position, but none of the other scenes will revert it. So we need to go back to the previous scenes and tell them to also control the super knob with a setting of our choice. With that done, I'm also going to add our string ensemble to the keyboard control group for scene 4. Let's have a quick review of what we've got so far. I'm going to switch to Performance Home and activate scene 1, and then use the part buttons to select my piano. To move on, I'm going to hit Common, which will activate my Rhodes and pad, and then we'll switch to scene 2, which will start the drums as soon as I hit the keys. Scene 3 will bring in the bass and change the arpeggio, and scene 4 will increase the arpeggio number and raise the super knob. Thus far, every time we've configured a scene to manage a particular setting, we've needed to add the same management facilities to the other programmed scenes. But using this program only what you need approach allows for some interesting possibilities, like using combinations of scenes to achieve a particular result. I'm going to program the remainder of the scenes to manage single systems, starting with the mixing system, which allows you to handle the volume and panning of each performance part, as well as the FX send levels and some aspects of the filter. I'll start with scene 5 and tell it to handle mixing, and then allow it to store the current mix settings that were loaded with the performance. On 6, which will also handle mixing, I'll dial in some alternative levels. Let's drop the level of the pad, and drop the level of the strings, and also reduce the filter cutoff for the pad. Because I've configured that mix using the hardware controls, I'll need to store the settings to the scene manually using Shift Scene 6. I can now go between the two different mix settings by switching between scenes 5 and 6. My final two scenes are going to control the AEG, or amplitude envelope generator. Scene 7 will store the initial settings, but scene 8 will reduce the attack and release for the pad and strings. Let's enable AEG for scene 8, and then go and configure those individual bits. So we'll pick up part 1, which is the pad, and I will have its amplitude envelope and reduce its amplitude, its attack, and its release way down, and store those to scene 8. Then I'll do the same for the strings, which is a AWM 2-part, so it works slightly differently, but here we are. Attack and release set to minimum, and store that to scene 8. And now we should be able to switch between those two different envelopes using scenes 7 and 8. And the same goes for the pad. So now I have a highly configurable performance where I can bring in parts using scenes 1 to 4, while independently switching between different mix levels on scenes 5 and 6, and two different AEG settings on scenes 7 and 8. As you can see, the approach I've just described requires some degree of planning to ensure that your scenes work together in the way that you expect, but the reward is an enormous degree of control. I spoke earlier about a foolproof approach where you really don't need to worry about how the scenes interplay. So I've saved a copy of this performance and I'm going to bring back the one that we had before we programmed any scenes. This time around, we're not going to program specific controls into our scenes. We're going to use a blunderbuss approach and program everything. So every time we program a new scene, we're going to enable control for every single one of its parameters. Starting with scene 1, we can set the parts with keyboard control, hit Shift scene 1, and we're done. For scenes 2 and 3, we also need to enable all the controls. And in fact, we might as well do scene 4 at the same time. So for scene 2, I bring in the drums. So let's bring those in and hit Shift scene 2, and that's done. For scene 3, we bring in the bass as well. Shift scene 3, and that's done. Scene 3 also switches the arpeggio to number 3, so we'll change that and shift scene 3, and that's finished. And then in scene 4, we want to bring in the arpeggio number 4 and the strings, so let's program that in with arpeggio number 4 and shift scene 4, and that's done. We can now switch instantly between our different scenes and everything works as expected, except I didn't program the super knob, did I? So let's ramp that up and store that to scene 4. And now we have effectively the same as what we programmed before, except now behind the scenes, every single parameter is being programmed. The drawback to this approach is that previously, I was able to independently adjust the mixer and the AEG settings using scenes 5 to 8, but I can't do that in this particular approach, because if I now set scenes 5 and 6 to only program the mixer, I could certainly change them round using scenes 5 and 6, but as soon as I selected one of the other scenes, the changes made by scenes 5 and 6 would be wiped out, because scenes 1 to 4 have also stored their own mixer settings. There is a workaround, and that would be to program scenes 5 to 8 in the way that I did previously, and then go through these scenes that we've just programmed and turn off their mixing and AEG control, so that when they're selected, they don't overwrite whatever setting was brought in by scenes 5 to 8. So I hope that's given you a decent understanding of how and when to use keyboard control and how to make use of scenes to build variations of your performance and create variations of your variations. There are a few things that can't currently be controlled by scenes, and I think the most significant of those is the ability to adjust the key ranges assigned to each part from scene to scene, which would be a really useful addition. I have posted an IdeaScale suggestion with my thoughts, which I've linked in the description below. In the next video, we'll tackle the subject of control assignments and see how to track down exactly what each assignable control is doing to a performance before moving on to a guide showing you how to make your own parameter assignments to Aftertouch, the Super Knob, and others.